19th century Dublin witnessed some really extraordinary fires, on occasion resulting in loss of life. And when the Kildare Street Club was engulfed in flames in November 1860, there was fury in the press at the helplessness of the response and how, to quote one paper, considering the defective means available for providing against the deplorable effects of such visitations, there is too much reason to dread that many others may still further swell that fatal list of fires. And on that occasion, 3 young female workers were killed. And it was clear that Dublin, a modern city, had a fire service that was anything but modern. And then 2 years later, arrived that modern fire service and a civic fire service. Its first chief was our subject today, James Robert Ingram. This year marks the 150th anniversary of the fire that began in a bonded warehouse in the Liberties and threatened to destroy the historic fabric of Dublin's south inner city, what's become known as the Liberties Whiskey Fire. And if you're here a long time, you might know that fire was one of the first episodes of this podcast. And what we did that day was we stood on the streets where the fire happened and we explored its course. The episode was very much about the fire itself. But marking the 150th anniversary, I thought we'd go back and do it in a different way. We'll shift the focus entirely from that fire onto the people who fought that fire, onto Ingram and the birth of modern day firefighting in Dublin. Some would say that Ireland's old friend, Napoleon Bonaparte, is arguably the father of modern firefighting, and definitely Paris represented a new approach with military-like structure to the question of how cities should confront the ever-present threat of fire. And great crises, and there were lots of them, the Great Fire of London, for example, forced much thinking on the issue of fire in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. But it's extraordinary how long it took for city authorities all over the world to think about firefighting as a civic obligation and a responsibility of the city. And as we'll hear today, the 19th century was just a really transformative time. There was new thinking about fire, new scientific approaches to firefighting. Fire was better understood than it had ever been before, and so was fire protection and fire prevention. And in Britain, Edinburgh and London, they would lead the way. As we'll hear, a Cork man and a Trinity College graduate from a very famous Irish family played no small role in developments there. Las Fallon, my father, is a retired firefighter who spent decades working in the very area of the city where that very famous whiskey fire happened, from Dolphin's Barn Fire Station. But his history of the whiskey fire has been expanded and republished for the anniversary, and the link is in the bio. Lovely little production, historic illustrations, poetry and more all brought together. But while the whiskey fire features today, this is very much a broader story about Victorian firefighting and the pioneering men behind it. If you're passing the Patriots Inn in Kilmainham, once named in honour of Queen Victoria, you might just about make out on the Kilmainham Lane side of the pub one of the last surviving fire marks in the city of Dublin. I promise you it's there, though it's difficult to see. A reminder of a time before we had a civic fire service and when insurance fire brigades would fight blazes in the city. The fire brigade historian Pat Poland says that the fire mark served a number of purposes. It marked the property, so it was obvious to all that the building was covered by insurance. It acted as an advertisement for an insurance company, and it left firemen responding to a call in no doubt as to which particular building was insured with their office. Insurance firefighting has some long-standing urban myths. For example, if they didn't have insurance, they wouldn't fight the fire. They would, but this was still for-profit firefighting, and priority back then was dictated by economic concern.
Insurance firefighting was firefight for profit. The great benefit to the customer was that in 1666, with the Great Fire of London, an awful lot of the guild houses had burnt down. Rich people had become poor people overnight, and rich people don't like becoming poor. So the idea of the existing insurance, which would have been on ships' cargoes and things like that, was extended out to property, to fire. And you would have your property appraised, you would agree a value, and you would pay a premium based on that. They had a fire mark which is put on the front of your house to show you're insured, and that initially that brigade would turn up to deal with your fire. Over time, any insurance brigade would deal with an insured property, and they'd sort out the payments afterwards among themselves. And over time again, they would deal with fires in the neighbourhood, but always giving preference to insured property. So if the local orphanage goes on fire and there's 20 kids hanging out the window, but a merchant 2 streets away is having a fire, and they're heading for the merchant.
The Kildare Street Club, one 19th century guidebook to Dublin said, is the most aristocratic club in Dublin. Now, fire doesn't care for such things. And when the Kildare Street Club went up in 1860, the scenes on the streets were completely chaotic. There was heroism displayed by the general public, but the night was hardly a good advertisement for strong firefighting. And undoubtedly, the events of November 1860 were the strongest imperative for change in the city of Dublin.
Well, go back slightly to 1860, and the reason for the Dublin Fire Brigade from Municipal Fire Brigade comes around. There's a fire in the Kildare Street Club, which is the home of the aristocracy, the landed gentry in Dublin and castle officials and so forth, or home away from home. It went on fire in 1860. A number of people were killed. There was a massive mess made of fighting the fire because insurance engines showed up which couldn't connect one to the other for supplying water. The insurance companies had no provision for rescuing people. Saving life wasn't insured, property was insured. So they didn't put any great provision for saving lives, ladders and so forth. So anyone that was rescued in that fire was actually rescued by civilians, by passers-by or onlookers. It brought it to a head. As I say, at this stage, as we're saying, Belfast was well established, Edinburgh was long established, and a number of other British cities already had their municipal brigades, some cases run by the police. In Dublin at the time, the corporation maintained a small fire engine at the old Whitehorse Yard Waterworks depot, which is now, it's off Wine Tavern Street, it's under civic offices. And the Dublin Metropolitan Police had a fire engine in Kevin Street, at the depot on Kevin Street, but only a single engine, a small enough engine. So they decided there had to be a municipal service. So they set it up in 1862. The preference would have been given in those days. In most brigades, London set the pattern in this, and most brigades adopted it, of sailors, seamen. Because in the days of sailing ships and tall ships, these were men who were used to hardship. There were men who were used to working in the worst weather conditions, men who were used to working at height on the old sailing ships, and were also familiar with the use of ropes and the tools that had been needed. The other group would be tradesmen, because again, people, carpenters, plumbers, people who knew how to put a house together, understood how a house would react in a fire and how it would come apart if at that. The other thing they had in Dublin was the next kind of down the scale would have been people ex-military, people, again, disciplined, uniformed organisations.
In Britain, there are names that are eternal to the story of firefighting. Any visitor to Edinburgh will encounter a statue on the Royal Mile, or what a good Scottish Republican would call the High Street, to James Braidwood, the founding father of the world's first municipal fire service, Edinburgh. Edinburgh would face phenomenal challenges in their infancy. I mean, we've all heard about the Great Fire of London. Who's heard of the Great Fire of Edinburgh? Forgotten now, but it burnt for 5 days and nights in November 1824. It left 13 people dead, including firemen, and destroyed tenements, shops and offices without distinction. Braidwood wrote at length about fire and fire prevention, and an introduction to one of his texts was pretty stark. The history of mankind from the earliest times has been one of alternate peace and war with fire. Beyond Braidwood, who's the father of civic firefighting in these islands, there was also Air Massey Shaw, a Trinity College graduate who would follow on from Braidwood.
Yeah, Massey Shaw is a really interesting man. He was from North Cork. He was a relation of George Bernard Shaw's, a cousin of George Bernard Shaw's, and he was part of the family, I believe, that are still around Shaw's almost nationwide, the big retailers. He had a peculiar career. He studied for the church, and then he decided he didn't want to be in the church, and he joined the army, and he took the shortcut to the army by joining the North Cork militia, the North Cork Rifles. Um, Based on his experience as a militia officer, he got the job of chief constable of the old Belfast City Police and moved to Belfast. And Belfast City Police ran the fire brigade. So they would have had a number of fire engines around the city, but it wouldn't have been the busiest fire brigade in the world. But based on his experience of running the Belfast Fire Brigade, he was offered the position of chief of what was then called the London Fire Engine Establishment. And that was just after James Braidwood, who had set up the Edinburgh Fire Brigade and had gone to London to manage the new fire engine establishment there, was killed at Tooley Street in a fire. Air Massey Shaw became Chief of London, and he became the quintessential Victorian British fireman.
One of Shaw's great contributions was the brass helmet, which the London Museum note remained in use until the world changed around them. Brass helmets were abandoned in the 1930s due to the hazard of live electric wires hanging from the ceilings of burning buildings and brushing against the conductive metal. But the brass helmet wasn't fashion, it was function, and what an Irishman put on heads in British firefighters in time would appear here and elsewhere.
It's a very well designed helmet because it's modular apart from anything else. Each piece of it can be replaced. It's designed with a comb on top, a hollow comb, which looks very well, but the actual idea of that was that a brick or a weight falling from above would hit that. It was like a crush zone before the weight was carried through to the actual head. The sweep of the back of the helmet was designed to take things like melting lead or melting tar from a roof or even hot water. And sweep it away that it wasn't running down the fireman's back or down his neck. The peak at the front was designed so it would hit the ground if the fireman fell before his face did. It was great. There was great. There was a lot of thought, a very ornamental piece, but actually a very practical piece when you look into it.
Braidwood and Shaw are pioneering figures, but so is our subject today, James Robert Ingram, the father of the Dublin Fire Department, as it was first known. A returning migrant, he'd fought fires in New York City, but like everything in 19th century New York, things there were compounded by other questions and tensions.
Ingram had emigrated in the 1850s to America, and he worked as a banknote engraver. That was his profession. But he joined the Niagara Hose Company in Lower Manhattan. At the time, it was the old volunteer New York Fire Department. And each unit was a standalone fire brigade of its own. Some of them would have been based on things like ethnicity. There would have been Irish fire department, Irish companies. There would have been German companies. Some would have been based around trades. In his case, the unit that he joined, the Niagara Hose Company, had an affinity with the Freemasons, and he was a member of the Freemasons in New York. So that would have been the established thing there. But they were very much a volunteer department. There was more cooperation than you would find, say, among the insurance brigades here. But they weren't a standalone organisation. That didn't come in until the end of the Civil War, when there was reorganisation of all local government in New York to do away with the old Tammany Hall politics and the rest. And the FDNY was formed after Dublin Fire Brigade. But it was a municipal service. And a lot of the people who'd been part of the volunteer department, which had a social status to it to be a fireman, were revolted by this new idea. They didn't want anything to do with it. And largely it was staffed. The new FDNY had to be staffed by immigrants. It had to be staffed by the Irish, by the Germans, by the Italians. And that's still a huge, strong influence and a huge part of their culture.
New York was a city that had its own challenges and fire hazards. Dublin, likewise, had its own unique risks and hazards. And that the job went to someone who'd worked outside of Dublin in itself is kind of interesting. He was also just 33 years of age, a very young man. There were massive challenges before him at the very beginning. And I think one of the big problems was trying to make this job appealing. Ironically, for a job that involved fighting fire, a sizable amount of time would be spent standing around in the cold.
Yeah, there's a lot of fire hazards in Dublin. The thing is that the Dublin Corporation decided they set up a committee to look into to take applications for the position of fire chief, and James Robert Ingram was successful. And this was a man coming from New York, from a totally different style of firefighting, from a totally different city to Dublin. Um, a number of the people who applied and weren't successful went on later to be quite successful chiefs of large British city fire brigades, municipal brigades. So he was given the job, and he was 33 at the time, and he was going to head up this new municipal service. So he arrived. It was a clean slate. He wasn't replacing anybody. He was setting the standards. Um, he brought a bit of New York with him. He brought the imagery from New York. The red short, the red flannel short, was very much part of the old volunteer department in New York. Each company would have their own variations of uniforms, but red flannel shorts were common. Um, Dublin firemen wore those. They wore their trousers and their leather boots. The only thing that would identify a Dublin fireman as part of the overall British service was the brass helmet. Other than that, he looked like someone who'd wandered in from the streets of the Bowery or Manhattan. Then he's faced with organising his men. The authorised strength of Dublin Fire Brigade was 40 men in total, including himself. He never really managed to get more than 25 at any stage. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy because it was a difficult job with long hours, bad pay and harsh discipline. And the fewer men there were to fill those 40 positions, the longer the hours, the worse the pay, the worse the more stringent the discipline. Every third night, a fireman would have to stand out through the night at what was called an escape station, a wheeled ladder for life saving, whereas positioned, a number of them were positioned at different places around the city. I think 7 of them in his state. Places like Nelson's Pillar or the Bank of Ireland. And there was a sentry box beside it, and the fireman had to stand through the night in his red flannel short. And if there was a fire in the area, he had to send word to the fire station to come with the engines, but he also had to round up passers-by to wheel the ladder along and then set to work to see if he could rescue people from the fire.
The fire that took hold on the 18th of June 1875 would propel Ingram's name into the international press, and it's a famous fire in its day, a surviving piece of local lore even now. And as the Daily Express told it, the glow lit up the whole district around and the heat became terrific. The burning whiskey poured in torrents from the doors and windows of a burning pile and rushed down Mill Street and the other streets of the locality in flaming lava-like streams. The flames from the whiskey streams rose 20 and 30 feet in height. Now, how that all began is still surrounded in some mystery, but the very conditions that allowed that fire to happen tell us a lot about Dublin and the economic position of Dublin.
You know, everything went. The 4 walls of the place were left standing, and that was it. And the ardent hoops from the barrels, that was the only thing that survived that night. The idea of putting a bonded warehouse with over 250,000 litres of whiskey at various stages, from immature spirits to fully matured whiskey, along with possibly the same again of other spirits which were being held in bond for city merchants in the middle of the Liberties, in the middle of a built-up area. Like, it was crazy, but again, it was part of that, what in today's terms, light touch legislation. The city wanted industry, wanted anything that would pay rates, employ people. This wasn't Belfast. We had none of the industrial rate space that Belfast had. There was no shipbuilding, there was no engineering, there was none of that, very little of it. What we had was drink. We had distilleries and we had breweries, and the Liberties was at the heart of it, what they would have called the Golden Triangle, running, say, from Guinness's and Powers up in Thomas Street out to through Rose down into DWD, Greenmount Distillery, the 2 Jamesons, Watkins Brewery there as well. If Manchester was Cottonopolis, if Belfast was Linonopolis, Dublin at its very best, possibly to be Gargalopolis, it was Alcoholopolis. It was based, a lot of the city economy was based around that.
One thing that's really odd about this blaze, though, is that it clearly had blazed away for some time, and by the time people realised what was happening, it was far too late.
The last person that we know was in there was at 4:30 in the afternoon, Mr. Lynn, who was an excise officer. The bonded warehouses were run as commercial enterprises, but they were under the control of the excise, the customs and excise. and they would literally have the key at the door. They would be the ones who opened it, who kept records of what was moved and when it was moved and so forth. We know he locked it up, and we have to assume it wasn't burning when he locked it up. And he forgot to mention it. And at 8:30 that night, the first indication, and this is the extraordinary thing, and even from a firefighter's point of view, this is a really extraordinary thing. The first indication anybody had that there was a fire was when the roof collapsed. That was a well-developed fire that had burned and built up strength and built up energy within that building to the point that it was able to burn away the roof. All of a sudden, when the roof is gone, fires need three things. They need heat, they need fuel, and they need oxygen. And when the roof was gone, they had unlimited oxygen. They had plenty of fuel, and the heat was certainly there.
At the time, Ingram's headquarters was on South William Street, a familiar building. The City Assembly Rooms, now home to the Irish Georgian Society, in the basement of that civic building. And it was clear immediately to Ingram that this was a job requiring more than just firefighting skills.
The full resources of the brigade from the two stations, which were Coppinger Row, which is just off South William Street, opposite Grogan's. Bear in mind, 7 of his men are out on escape duty around the city with the ladders. He's only got 25. Everybody else is there, including himself, and it's a pitifully small force faced with the biggest fire in Dublin in the 19th century. From the very start, crowds are starting to come in, so he has to see what resources he has. The police, the DMP, sent 150 constables to the scene. Now, the DMP were probably more tuned into what Dublin crowds could get up to, given half a chance, so they swamped the place with policemen. What Ingram did, he would have had a certain number of corporation workmen, supernumeraries as they were called, who could be called on, fellows from the waterworks, to run out hose or to make down hydrants. But he sent for troops from the Dublin garrison. And again, Dublin was ringed with British military barracks at the time. So up to 300 soldiers arrived. Now, a number of them, some of them were used for crowd control. Some of them were actually used to guard whiskey which had been salvaged. There was about 25 or 30 barrels of whiskey salvaged. They put it in Cork Street. And at various times through that night, they actually had to threaten bayonet charges on the crowd who were trying to seize it. The rest of the troops were put to use. Normally, they would have been used to pump the engines. In this case, he couldn't pump the engines. He couldn't put water on the burning whiskey. So he put water and petrol. It would just float on top and keep burning. And it would have added to the velocity of it and added to the area that was covered. His thought was that he had to slow the burning alcohol down because it's literally a burning flood. It's the worst of two disasters. So he had the soldiers issued with shovels, and he had them build barricades of manure. No shortage of manure. The streets are full of it. The corporation gather it and bring it to depots. He had those depots emptied and brought back to the Coombe. He also had the sludge from the local tanneries, and there was plenty of tanneries in that area. He then had the toilet pits, the ash pits from the back of the tenements emptied and brought onto the streets and poured onto the streets as well. He needed big organic barricades, which would slow the whiskey down. It would come to them, eventually overflow them and go on. But in the time that it took to overflow them, a lot of the alcohol would have burnt off, and the next one would burn more off, and the next one would burn more off. So it was an extraordinary feat of firemanship. Like, considering he had a tiny force of men, a huge fire, and a fire that had the potential to destroy a huge chunk of inner city Dublin. By the time he got there, burning whiskey was flowing into the sewers. Then it was getting underground into the sewers, even into the River Poddle, and igniting sewer gas. So there were reports of explosions along through the night. He had the shores blocked up straight away. Had that gone on, had it gone through the Poddle to the sewers, it would have ended up in the Liffey. You would have quite easily had a burning flood in the Liffey.
And while this was an age when people like Braidwood had published on how to fight fires, there's no precedent for these scenes, at least in Dublin. I mean, there will be a heap of distillery fires across the world, and even a few later on in Dublin, but this is all new. And that meant that the crisis required quick thinking.
It was very scientific. Well, it was scientific firefighting, but also this was not textbook stuff. Nobody had ever, kind of come up with this idea before. It wasn't, that you turn to page 37 and see how you deal with a huge bonded warehouse burning down in a flood of whiskey. One of the things he brought back from New York, along with his red shorts and the rest of it, was a kind of an ability to think outside the box and to think outside the normal kind of strictures of the fire service.
One of the other massive fires of Ingram's time took hold at the Theatre Royal in 1880. And in illustrations of it, they're just amazing. You see posters for Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves as Ingram's men battle a massive blaze without much success. Theatres had a habit of going on fire in the 19th century. They were dangerous places, wooden structures, large amounts of fabric, curtains, drapery, cloth scenery, fire effects. You know, they were a perfect storm in some ways. James Braidwood had actually written about theatres as being really dangerous places. In theatres, he wrote, that part of the house, which includes the stage and scenery, should be carefully divided from that where the spectators assemble by a solid wall carried up to and through the roof. The opening in this wall for the stage should be arched over, and the other communication secured with iron doors, which would be kept shut while the audience was in the house. By this plan, there would be abundance of time for spectators to retire before fire could reach that part of the theatre which they occupy. Ingram's men failed to save the Theatre Royal, but they did prevent further destruction that night.
You know, on the best days in the world, the best fire brigades in the world will build a car park. If circumstances go against you, and circumstances can go against you very easily. A theatre is a big, highly flammable space. Once it starts to burn again, it's very, very difficult to put that out. And by its nature, it's also a secure place. So you have limited points of entry and exit and a highly flammable interior. So no, the Theatre Royal, the success in the Theatre Royal isn't preventing it from spreading into the adjoining streets. You know, there are times that the actual building that's burning is going to burn. It's gone. And the achievement there can be preventing the spread of that fire.
The illustrations of Ingram's men working are fantastic. There's lots of them, and they capture the fact that he was kind of a public figure and a personality in the city. People in Dublin knew these great public servants, people like Charles Cameron, the chief medical officer. He was a household name. And Ingram and his work was widely known in Dublin. Journalists had a tendency of showing up, standing a little bit too close to burning buildings, giving blow-by-blow accounts of what was happening. And you read the newspapers, really extraordinary, the lengths that journalists were willing to go to. There was the case of a woman trapped in a blazing apartment when Captain Ingram lost not a moment in trying to save her from the perilous position in which she was placed. When the brigade rushed to the scene of a massive fire at the city sawmills, the press said if energy, promptness, courage and discipline were required, we are happy to say they were forthcoming when wanted. Crowds followed Ingram and his men, even sometimes into harm's way.
There's a number of illustrations of turnouts of the time, and what you see along with the galloping horses and the firemen in the brass helmets, and the crowd running behind them because they want to watch. This is going to be good. This is going to be an evening's entertainment while this goes on. Not necessarily with free drink as the whiskey, the Liberties fire, but certainly free entertainment, a massive public spectacle. So the newspapers cover that in depth as well. There'll always be a crowd. There'll always be a crowd to watch.
But sadly, Ingram died a sad death. The occupational hazards of his job played no small role. And for someone who had done so much for the city of Dublin, there's something terrible about Ingram's fate. He's now buried in an unmarked grave. And despite the best efforts of Laz, still without so much as a plaque in Dublin. I just find that extraordinary. If Ingram isn't a Dublin hero, who the hell is? And there are plans to right that wrong in the future.
He died young. He was a young man when he took over. He was 33 when he became chief officer of a city fire brigade. He was in his 50s when he died. 53. So he was chief officer for 20 years. He'd been diagnosed a year or two before his death with tuberculosis. So he knew he was dying because there was no cure in those days. He was married. He had 3 children. One of his children had predeceased him, had died in infancy. The child was actually born in 1875, the year of his great triumph of the whiskey fire. He lost he lost one of his children that year. He lost his second-born child. His firstborn would die less than 2 years after himself. So his wife was left a young widow uh, with initially two children, then lost one of them. Yeah, it's a sad story. And the thing about it too is that an awful lot of Ingram's history has been lost. Now, it was lost deliberately in a sense, in that in 1938, Dublin Fire Brigade got a new chief officer. And one of the first actions that he did was to contact the corporation and ask, could he destroy all records? Anything that wasn't legally required to be there was destroyed. And so we lost all the Victorian records. We lost a huge amount of the records related to the War of Independence and Civil War, and that whole era went as well. Very little survived. Some did, but they generally survived because either they overlooked destroying them, or somebody at the time had the sense to actually hide them. But we lost a huge amount. We lost all the stuff at Ingram. There's only one photograph of the man, and it's a terrible, I use it in the book, but it's a terrible photograph. It's just basically shades of grey. You can see where somebody actually filled in the outline with pen to put a proper shape onto it. And he lived well within the age of common photography. So there had to have been other images. His wife, Emma Thompson, she died, she never remarried, she died a widow. Presumably when she died, the house was probably cleared, and whatever paperwork they had, photographs and whatever, were lost to us at that point. It's the one thing I would love, if there are people out there who feel that they are related to that Ingram family, I would love to hear from them. He's buried in Mount Jerome. He's buried in an unmarked grave in Mount Jerome.
Thanks a lot for coming on again and expanding on that story into something broader. The science of 19th century firefighting is really interesting. And the next time you're in Edinburgh, make sure you go and see that great statue to James Braidwood. The Great Liberty's Whiskey Fire is in all good bookshops now. Buy it from an independent one. Why not? And maybe raise a glass of that highly flammable stuff to Mr. Ingram while you're at it. The programme for the Dublin Festival of History has gone to print, I'm delighted to say, so we'll hopefully be able to share that with you soon. Really, really excited for that. It is the largest free history festival of its kind anywhere in the world. Looking forward to recording an episode this week with the author of a great new book on the Irish famine, or the Great Hunger. Really enjoyed reading that book, and I'm looking forward to doing that interview this week. So I'll be back soon. Until then, slán go fóill.